I want to unpack the concept of law a bit. Law, by its very nature and its very definition, implies universal truth. By definition, law is absolute truth. Kant describes two philosophers as having a conversation with regard to the nature of absolute truth. And he describes one as milking a he-goat, while the other one holds a sieve underneath. This is to illustrate the point that while he-goats don't give milk and there is no absolute truth. So if there's no absolute truth, how is it that we come to know laws? I'm going to describe three different kinds of laws. The first kind, mathematical laws, which are absolute truth, but only exist in our minds. These are synthetic truths. These are truths that are made up in the mind of man. Geometry is based on the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line, and the arithmetic is based on a perception of time. First you have one, then you have another, then you have another. So there's the concept of counting. And these are space and time are two modes of perception from which the laws of mathematics can be derived. We don't need to actually have any empirical experience to derive the laws of mathematics. Now, mathematics is perfect and ideal within itself, but it can never really describe the real world in concise terms. You can have one basket of apples, you can have another basket of apples, and you can describe both of those baskets by a number. But that number is not fully descriptive of the apples. In one basket, more can be rotten than the next, and so on and so on. So the numerical description and approximations to empirical reality are approximations and not really exact and precise truths. For the physical laws and the sciences, first-year science students are often asked to do an experiment, and this consists of each student getting a little cardboard box that's closed and it contains an object inside, and you perform scientific experiments to determine what the object is inside the box. So through a set of observations you develop a model of what is inside the box. You may conclude that it's a nut and be able to predict the box's behavior in terms of thinking of it as containing a nut inside. And this model may very well work in describing the reality with respect to that box, but still you don't really actually know what's in it. So science in itself is really based on observation, and this experiment is done to illustrate people the philosophy of science, which is based on the scientific method, which is to make observations, form hypotheses, and then try and disprove those hypotheses. Once you reach a hypothesis that cannot be disproven, then your statement is, your hypothesis becomes a scientific truth or a scientific law. Science, my boy, is made up of mistakes, but they are mistakes which it is useful to make because they lead little by little to the truth. The third set of laws are the moral laws, and they are really quite separate from science. Does the world exist as we see it, as science sees it? Can science really ever see what's inside the box? I'm going to give a short Kantian explanation of this in the last section of this video. This is a critical question with regards to how it relates to law. If the world exists as we see it, then we are merely part of a giant chemical reaction governed by the laws of cause and effect, and each subsequent state can be determined from the previous states. There's nothing in the world that happens by chance. What I'm going to do next week is already predetermined. What I'm going to think next week is already predetermined by the structure of the molecules in my brain and chemicals and whatever. Everything can be determined by experience. If there is more to the world than cause and effect, this is free will. And free will is something that we need to describe and explain human experience. And free will gives us the moral laws, and I'm going to get into this more later. And the purpose of moral law is to maximize that freedom, to infringe as little as possible on the freedom of will of others. So for instance, parking your car in the middle of the street to run into the store gets in the way of everybody else who happen to be driving along the same road and want to go somewhere. So we need a law to maintain that freedom. Moral laws are absolute, written, universal truths, and they come from priests and philosophers deducing the word of God. The existence of free will is the proof of the existence of God. We assume that God created us because he wanted to see us happy. So theology is really all about formulating these universal moral laws so that we can create happy societies. And the existence of a God is required to generate the precepts from which to create universal laws and from which to base a society on. Conscience is known as the hard problem and has three basic characteristics. One, a conscious being has self-awareness. Two, a conscious being is aware of the knowledge of moral laws, rational reasoning required to maximize free will. And three, all thinking is framed in causality and purpose, and this is the last part of Kant's third critique of judgment. So this is not really a widely stated thing with regard to consciousness, because Kant really isn't in the progressive world academic picture anymore. Why are we here? Why do we exist? Where does this question come from? The components of consciousness are independent of space and time and therefore quite separate from the physical world defined by the laws of science. The laws that protect freedom are true for all time and in all places. They don't have an empirical or a scientific component. Universals cannot have ambiguous terms such as happiness or well-being. So if we're going to create laws around, let's say, maximizing the well-being, well, what's well-being or happiness? Those are ambiguous terms, and you can't write laws with ambiguous terms because those terms can change meaning. When the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Matthew 22-36. There are three well-known law books in the West, the Christian Bible, the Jewish Talmud, and the Islamic Quran.